Okay, so this is just to show you how you can get colour on fabric just using basic watercolour paints. We've got a little palette here just with your basic watercolour set, but as I've said before, you could use acrylic paint that's watered down. I think that is the main important factor, is that when you're putting paint on fabric, you want it quite watery. You can actually wet the fabric first, so you can actually get a little bit of water on your fingers and actually put the water on the fabric just so that it's not too dry, and then really mix the shades of colour that you want. And we're thinking about the sea, okay, and then you're adding them onto the fabric like this. What you'll notice is that they will bleed together. And what I've done before I've painted it on is I've actually put some of the curved lines very lightly in pencil. You probably can't see them because I didn't want them to be visible after the painting, but getting the curved lines of this huge wave that I'm starting to build up, and then starting to put the paint on quite wet, quite watery. And if you get impatient like I do, and you're trying to think about the stitching and you're excited to get started, but your fabric is still wet, you could always dry it with a hairdryer, which is quite a good thing to do. Okay, so you can see, even though I've already got stitching on, I can start to build up some of the colour in here and even add it around the stitching. Just move that needle out of the way to increase those shades of blues to get that feeling of power and movement in the sea. Okay, so you can keep alternating between stitch and paint, but obviously if you're stitching into an area that's wet, dry it off a little bit first. Okay, so you can start to see that some of these brush strokes are actually starting to give a little bit more movement, a little bit more power, blending in like that. Okay, so I'm just going to show you some stitches. We've got some in here already. So we've got a running stitch, which helps if you need broken lines. Okay, and if you remember looking back to our artist work, there was lots of different types of lines. We had some broken lines, so running stitch is quite good for that. Then we've got back stitch, which gives you a continuous line, so it takes your eye from the middle and swirls it all the way around, like the swirl in the movement of the water. And then we're going to add satin stitch as well. Okay, and I've also got different types of threads here, so different types and thicknesses of threads are going to give you a richer quality to your image. So there's some very thin machine thread, we've got some much thicker embroidery thread, and then one which is slightly in between this one here. Okay, so basic running stitch. All right, just put a knot in the end of your thread. Okay, bring it up through the back. Let's move these out of the way. Go on to a dry piece here. Okay, I'm going to try and exaggerate the line that's already on the work. So I'm looking at this line here and trying to exaggerate it. And your running stitch, you come up from the back and then you do your first stitch, leave a little gap, okay, because this is evoking your broken lines. All right, and then try to keep your stitches the same length and the same distance apart, because that way it will look a little bit more even, not too random. So you can see starting to build up running stitch like that. Okay, for your back stitch, again, I'm going to use the thicker thread for the back stitch here, and I've put a knot in the end, and I'm going to come up through the back, and back stitch starts the same as running stitch, so I'm going to add a bit of back stitch in here. Okay, so you start it the same way, put that in, and then you bring your needle up. Okay, but now instead of going forward, you're going to go backwards, so you're going to go back into the hole that you have just worked on, and then you're going to bring the needle back up again. Okay, so there's no gap. Just move that thread out of the way, so hopefully you can see there's no gap there, and then we're going to go back and forward. And that's going to create a nice continuous line which is going to add to the swirl. If I took it all the way up here and round into the middle, it's going to give more and more layers of threads. Okay, and then the final one, which I'm going to use this thread here, this white one. The final one, Okay, and again I've put a knot in the bottom of the thread. I'm going to come up through the back is Satin Stitch, and Satin Stitch is really just blocking in an area, so I might decide that I want the inside of the wave to be totally blocked in. Okay, so I'm going to come up through the back again, and maybe I'm going to start to block it in between these lines. Okay, so I'm just going to bring that down and up, trying to keep it next to one another. So it's like shading really with a pencil, where you're actually just blocking in sections, repeating the stitch over and over. So you're starting to fill in that area, and if I fill in all that area, it's going to give a big chunk of white. Okay, so this is just one idea, but you can use, remember, add beads, add shells to show all the things that are being thrown up by the water if you want to, or have a look at some different textile designers and look at the way they use stitch to inspire you with a different type of result.